Zulu Hour, a Warrior Series Short Story, Book 1. By Ty Patterson. Chapter 1. The six-man team crept silently through the night, single file, and reached the outskirts of the village, where they halted at a hand signal from the leader. All were dressed in camo gear, had darkened their faces, and carried their assault rifles, handguns, NVGs, knives, spare mags, and other equipment with ease. That ease came from long practice, for they were an elite U.S. Special Forces team, led by Zeb Carter. They were hunting Mohammed Jama, a commander in ID's forces. Jamma and his small band of men had attacked several aid convoys and had fired upon the UNOSOM-2 forces and the Task Force Ranger, TFR. His assaults had inflicted several casualties and killed 3 relief workers and 2 nurses. Capturing him had become a priority for Zeb's team, since Jamma was fast acquiring a cult status among the militants, and his hit-and-run tactics were widely being adopted by the rest of ID's forces. TFR had received intel that Jamma was hiding in a village on the outskirts of Mogadishu, with a small band of men. The village, a collection of huts on the banks of the Somalia to the southwest of the capital, had a population of less than 300. Most of the villagers were animal herders who sold meat in the city. A few of them fished in the river, and less than a handful were farmers, since war had nearly destroyed that occupation in the village. A few of the huts were thatched, a couple of them were concrete, all of them arranged around a dusty track that ran through the settlement. Surrounding the village was dense undergrowth and trees, with the river flowing a quarter of a mile away. Zeb stood in the shadow of a tall tree and watched the village through his NVG. At 2 a.m., nothing moved in the village. Zeb didn't move either, and neither did his team. The rest of his crew was hunkered down in the undergrowth, spaced out, their eyes on scopes, their fingers ready. The intel had been sketchy. To call it intel was stretching it, but TFR and UNOSOM-2 had to work with what they had. All that had been relayed to TFR were a few sightings of a tall, bearded, bald man who looked like Jamma, in the vicinity of the village. The man was armed on the few occasions he had been spotted, and had been accompanied by other armed men. The reports had to be investigated since Jamma had a penchant for hiding in small villages, using women and children to shield his murderous activities. Zeb and his crew had set out in a Humvee, equipped with their automatic weapons, and had stashed the vehicle a mile away from the village. They had covered the distance on foot, and on nearing the village had separated, in contact with one another via their radio links. Zeb stood for long moments as beads of sweat trickled down his neck, and was absorbed in his combat suit. The night was warm, typical of an August night in and around Mogadishu, and the air barely stirred, adding to the heat. He was uneasy, not liking the stillness of the night. It's the dead of the night, for Christ's sakes. What did you expect? This is Somalia, not New York. I'm going in, he spoke softly, and got acknowledging clicks from his crew. They knew the drill by now. He usually went in on a recon run. They provided cover. It was risky, and ideally they would have spent more time on surveillance, but the poor intelligence meant that there had to be eyes on before engaging. He crawled out of the shadows, keeping below the skyline, knowing that at least one in his unit would have him on scope. Before him was open ground, which at one point, long before the Civil War broke out, had been lush fields. He crossed the ground as fast as he could, guided by instructions in his earpiece, and reached the first line of houses. The houses were nothing more than shacks with crumbling walls and broken roofs. He counted 15 of them from where he was, on either side of the road. There will be more, maybe another 20 or 30 of them, since the village has 300 people. He sniffed the air. No smells of cooking. He didn't expect any, not this late in the night. It was dogs that he was wary of, dogs and other domestic animals. There didn't seem to be any. His senses heightened. A village with no animals? That was unheard of. He crawled round the first house, thankful that it was dark in color, providing background for his combat suit to blend in. The house didn't have a window, just a door, which was open a few inches. Maybe for air to circulate. The coast was clear on the left, as it was on the right. There were houses on the other side of the road, but no movement appeared in any of them. He strained his ears. No sounds of snoring either. His sense of unease deepened. This wasn't normal. He peered down the line of houses as they petered out, and the dusty track disappeared into the undergrowth. Might as well risk everything. He rose slowly, his weapon locked and loaded, ready to fire at the first sign of hostilities. No hostiles appeared. He got closer to the open door, poised on the balls of his feet, and peered inside swiftly. It was empty. Clothing lay scattered on the floor, and the stench of oil and grease assaulted his nose, but no human was inside the house. He went around the house, and at a whispered go from his unit, darted across open space and approached the second hut. It turned out to be empty as well. He raised the barrel of his M16, looking around, but saw no one. Sitrep. Clear. Clear. More clears came into his earpiece. Zeb raced across the road and went to the opposite hut. Empty. He threw caution to the wind and raced down the track, checking each and every hut. All of them were empty. He returned to the first hut and went to its rear, knowing he was in his crew's sights. Watch your backs. Village is empty. This could be a trap. Gunfire shattered the silence of the night, as if on cue. Chapter 2. Zeb dove to the ground and rolled away just in time as rounds thumped the ground where he had been standing. He crawled desperately, seeking cover behind the hut, rounds whistling in the air and pinging off the corrugated sheets of metal that were on the hut. "It's a trap," Mike, one of his team members, said laconically in his ear. "Casualties?" Zeb demanded. "None. They are behind us. We are engaging." Engage carefully. And also retreat. Taking on a force of unknown size wasn't a great idea, especially if they were outnumbered. Roger. There are 2 or 3 hostiles at your 2 pinning you down. I'll flush them out. Gary will provide cover. Zeb peered around the hut, cursing himself for not bringing his NVG, and saw nothing but the dark shadow of the tree line. Flashes of fire emerged from it, and while he was tempted to return it, caution prevailed. It didn't look like the hostiles had night vision. They had somehow spotted his silhouette against the hut, and had opened the ball. Too early from the looks of it, otherwise he would have been peppered with rounds. The firing increased in volume, indicating his unit had joined the fight. Zeb crawled as fast as he could, using all available cover, taking care not to rustle any undergrowth. The tree line was 200 feet away, it felt like 2 miles. He zigged and zagged on the hard ground, perspiration streaming down his face and dripping to the ground. "We have you. Some of the unknowns are quiet. Maybe they're down or have run away. There are still others though," Mike told him. A flare arced through the sky suddenly and landed on one of the thatched roofs and set it ablaze. Another followed, and yet another house went up in flames. The night turned to orange, firing increased from both sides as each side realized they had lost the cover of the dark. Zeb was 15 feet away from much-needed protection. He risked a quick glance but didn't see anything. There were still rounds seeking him, but most of the action was between the hidden gunman and his unit. He rose warily and set out on a desperate run, swerving randomly. A yell sounded from somewhere and bullets came his way, thankfully not close. He plunged into the thicket he had identified, raised his gun, and sought targets. He was some distance away from Mike and the rest of his unit. The fire was at its peak and lit the tree line. His men seemed to be holding their own, and Zeb knew they would be inching back to the rendezvous point from where they could hot-foot it back to their vehicle. He also knew they would take down as many hostiles as they could. Movement. 2 shadows moved out from behind a tree, one murmured something and a torch flew into the sky. Zeb snapped up his M16 and let loose a short burst. The first one caught the flamethrower flush in his chest and he went down. The second man turned a startled look in Zeb's direction, sprayed back in retaliation, and set off at a run. Tall, bald, bearded. Zeb ducked and caught a quick glimpse of the surviving man. Adrenaline surged through him. Jamma. He loosed off another burst, but the warlord was swiftly making his way between trees and short bushes. away from Zeb's unit and towards the river. Zeb set off in pursuit, ducking and darting through low-hanging branches, his senses alert for another trap. There didn't seem to be one. Jamma, if that was him, seemed to be running in a straight line, and when he reached open ground, Zeb could make him out clearly. Powerfully built, his legs were pumping as hard as they could, a rifle slung behind his back. "That's Jamma for sure," Zeb confirmed when the fleeing man turned once to look back. "He's out of ammo, that's why he's fleeing." Zeb thought of bringing him down with his rifle, and rejected the idea as swiftly as it had entered his mind. TFR would like him alive. He could make out another tree line, 300 feet away, on the banks of the river. Can't let him get there. He'll disappear into the darkness. He upped his pace, striding evenly, breathing easily despite the weight of his equipment. 20 feet separated them. He could hear the man's harsh breathing. 15 feet. He could make out sweat on Jamma's head. 10 feet. Zeb left the ground in a low dive and went for the warlord's legs. Jamma fell but twisted as quick as an eel, his rifle barrel coming up. Zeb slapped it away and punched the man hard in the stomach. Jamma evaded and kicked out with a leg. It caught Zeb on the shoulder, and its power numbed him for a moment. Jamma slithered away and scrambled to his feet, and in the dim light, a gleam appeared at the end of his hand. A blade. He swung at the prone Zeb, who ducked just in time. Zeb flung soil in Jamma's face, making the warlord retreat, allowing Zeb to rise to his feet. Jamma clawed at his eyes for a moment and surged forward. Zeb didn't retreat. The knife came up. Zeb clubbed the attacking hand away with a bunched left fist, punching Jamma's forearm. Zeb turned sideways and got inside Jamma's reach. His elbow shot out, seeking Jamma's throat. It found the man's fleshy shoulder and gouged deep. Jamma hissed and brought the knife up again. Zeb caught his wrist and tried applying a lock, but the man was covered in sweat. Or oil. Zeb's grip slipped, and for a second the knife resumed its upwards journey to Zeb's heart. Zeb smashed his forehead on Jamma's nose. It shattered. Another headbutt split Jamma's lips. Zeb lost track of time. The village disappeared. Sound vanished. Jamma remained. That peculiar surging in Zeb remained. The surging that fueled intense attack and blurringly fast moves. A concrete-edged hand clubbed Jamma's wrist. The knife fell. Zeb's hand bunched again and rabbit punched Jamma's sternum. Jamma, taller and larger than Zeb, was trying to wrap his hands around his opponent. The blow to his middle made him gasp. Zeb followed it up with more jabs, raining them so fast and from so close, Jamma had no time to recover and react. He raised his elbow again and shattered the warlord's jaw. A shout came to him from a distance, and that strange surging in him accelerated. Krav Maga strikes to the left of Jamma's body dislocated the warlord's shoulder. Another strike broke 2 ribs. Jamma roared in agony and fell. An answering yell came from behind. Zeb landed a hammer blow to Jamma's neck and rolled away, turning swiftly, his thigh-strap knife rising to his hand instinctively. 1 second to focus on the approaching man. Not friend. Definitely hostile. The running man was unlimbering his rifle while on the run. He was close enough for Zeb to see the whites of his eyes. Zeb's knife flew in the air, silent and deadly, and pierced the man's shoulder. Zeb powered himself off the ground and flung himself at the hostile in a low dive, making his body as compact as possible. His shoulder rammed into the attacker, his left arm twisted the man's rifle barrel away and rammed it back into the man. The man went down, Zeb on top of him, and with a savage yanking motion, Zeb finished him. Zeb spun around ready to go at Jamma, but Jamma was out of it. The warlord lay wheezing, drawing tortured breaths through his mouth, his one hand flailing on the ground. Jamma wouldn't be fighting anymore. Chapter 3. Zeb was stripping and cleaning his rifle the next day, in the tiny cabin he shared with 3 other operatives in their camp in Mogadishu, when Mike approached. The grizzled veteran, older than Zeb by 7 years, leaned against the door jamb and sucked on a matchstick. Never seen anything like that, he mused, watching the younger man's hands move swiftly and surely. Like what? Zeb looked up, not pausing. A clean weapon was an operative's friend. Care and attention to his rifle came before any casual conversation. The way you fought with Jamma, Mike shifted and rubbed his shaven head with a palm that looked like rough leather. I had you in my scope and was looking for an angle to bring Jamma down. I didn't get it. I spotted the other dude and was about to plink him when you knifed him. He shook his head in disbelief, the night's memory still fresh. Where did you learn that? I've seen some moves in my life, but that speed, that ferocity, for a moment I thought he had you, but it wasn't even a contest, was it? Zeb shrugged and started assembling the rifle. They were Krav Maga moves. Nothing special. All of us know that style. Anyone could have brought him down. Not anyone. I've seen operatives, but none like you, Mike thought as he watched the younger man rise and place his weapon neatly against a wall. You might not know it, buddy, but you've got quite the reputation. Mike stifled a smile as he left the cabin. He spat the matchstick from his mouth, neatly landing it in a bin, and got an appreciative whistle from a passing operative. He stopped at a water fountain, and the cold liquid took him back to that day in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Carter and 3 operatives had been deployed in that region to scout a terrorist camp. The Hindu Kush mountain range had some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world, which was why the camp was located in the mountain range. Information on the camp was sparse. All that the U.S. intelligence agencies knew was that the camp existed in those mountains, a base in which new recruits were trained and from which raids were conducted. They knew its rough location, and it was left to Zeb and his team to locate it, conduct surveillance, and report back. The 4 of them had halo-jumped 10 miles away from the suspected camp, had trekked at night, and had set up base amidst a formation of rocks 3 miles from the camp. The plan was to set out at dawn and get closer to the camp, and conduct a recon operation. They never got to execute their plan. Dawn came, and with it an ambush. A bunch of Afghani tribal fighters, some of the most ferocious warriors in the world, spotted their base and attacked. They got pushed back by withering fire from Carter's team, but the attackers scented an easy victory. They were many, the Americans were just 4. Capturing or killing American soldiers would be a major coup for them. They didn't give up. They kept firing throughout the day, pinning down Zeb and his men and surrounding them. Several of them charged on foot, darting from one stony outcropping to another, and 6 tribals reached the rocky hideout just when it turned midday. Carter took out the first hostile, and when the attackers came too close to use weapons, resorted to hand combat. The skirmish was brutal and quick, and less than 15 minutes later all 6 fighters were dead. So was one operative, and another had taken a serious injury to his chest. A third operative had taken a round in his shoulder, while Carter had a punctured thigh. The tribals attempted another run in the evening, this time with 3 fighters. One of them reached the hideout and charged, his rifle blazing. Luckily, his shots went wide, and he didn't get another opportunity. Carter's round blew his head off. Carter's men were running low on ammo, food, and water. Their radios were running out of juice. Then there was the cold as the night set in. Bitter, biting cold that numbed the fingers and slowed reaction time. The hostiles had all the time in the world, and were waging a battle of attrition. They were waiting for the night to deepen, knowing the Americans were fatigued, and were planning an all-out attack. Carter was preparing for a last defense. He and the other able operatives had collected all ammo and divvied it up. They spread out, Carter covering the front, the other operatives watching the rear. The 3 surviving men knew they wouldn't live through the night, not unless a miracle happened. They were determined to take as many tribals with them as possible. Carter got the miracle he prayed for. A Black Hawk, packed with grim-faced operatives, had flown out of Rawalpindi on receiving their earlier radio messages. It reached just in time, as the first wave of attackers started pouring into the cairn of rocks. It wiped out the larger body of hostiles who were behind the attacking men, and as more operatives fast roped down, the odds turned in Carter's favor. Mike was one of the first men to touch ground, and he provided covering fire for the new arrivals who joined the fight in the hideout. Later, when the firefight ended, Mike approached Carter. "I'm sorry," Carter spoke softly, nodding in the direction of his dead companion. Mike remembered shaking his head. The man and his fellow operatives would have died if the bird hadn't arrived in time. He probably had bad intelligence, which had led to the ambush. Most operatives would have thanked the chopper's arrival. Not Carter. Carter was downright ashamed that he had lost a man. Much later, he would hear from the surviving operatives how Carter had fought, initially with his weapons, then with his knife, and when that had been lost, with his bare hands. "We would be dead without him," one operative had said, and the other had agreed. The survivors spoke of the speed and ferocity in Carter, of the likes they hadn't seen before. Mike had been in Carter's unit ever since the Hindu Kush Mountains. Zeb was on a rooftop in Mogadishu on the second day from Jamma's capture, with only his sniper rifle, radio, and handgun for company. He was tasked with clearing frequently traveled streets and alleys through which TFR personnel traveled. The city's narrow streets and closely laid out houses provided cover for ambushing parties who attacked the military and aid convoys almost at will. The small winding roads slowed down the military vehicles, giving the rebel forces enough time to not only mount attacks, but to chase down convoys. Potholes and strategically placed burning tires or mines further helped in restricting the free and rapid movement of TFR vehicles. Zeb had studied the city's layout at length, and when he had suggested taking to the rooftops to neutralize the rebel fighters, he had been the natural candidate for the role. The rooftops provided one significant advantage to a sniper. It was often possible to leap from one roof to another in several neighborhoods and follow the attacking rebels. Providing supporting fire from the top was a great idea in theory, however, in practice, it was perilous, since Ideed's men too had realized the value of rooftop warfare. Zeb had come across opposing gunmen on a few occasions, and only his quick reactions and superior marksmanship had saved him. He persevered though, since the benefits far outweighed the risks. He was overlooking Via Lenin, a street that sounded more grandiose than it was. It was like many other roads in the city, unevenly maintained, litter and the wreckage of burned-out vehicles dotting its length. Zeb had moved from one roof to another along the street as the day progressed, retracing his route frequently, not stopping in any one position long enough for rebel forces to spot him. He didn't see anyone else on any roof, perhaps it was too hot for even Ideed's soldiers. He knew there would be a ranger convoy on the street at some point in the day, he didn't know when. He swigged from his water can and wiped beads of sweat as he squinted down the length of the street. No military vehicle. Nothing resembling a convoy. A few Somalians crossed the street, blissfully unaware of the man above them. A car wreck was at the other end of the road, its shell shining dully under the sun. It was past noon, when the shadows were the shortest, that the Ranger Jeep turned a corner and entered the street. Zeb recognized the vehicle which moved from underneath him and proceeded to his right, towards the car wreck beyond which was a crossroad. Zeb rose to follow it, his rifle ready, his steps even, his senses alert. The vehicle passed a bombed-out hotel and was nearly at the car's shell when a bunch of men spilled out behind it. They emerged from a house, gesticulating furiously in the direction of the Jeep. Zeb could hear cursing and swearing in the air, and watched the men carefully while darting glances at the military vehicle. Decision time. Stick with the vehicle or stay with the crowd. Staying with the mob won out. It could react dangerously. The Rangers in the Jeep could take care of themselves. The angry shouting grew in volume, and hearing the tone, Zeb lay down and put his scope to his eye. It didn't take long for an angry crowd to turn ugly, and it looked like the Rangers were unaware of the potential danger on their six. The Jeep didn't speed up, neither did any heads poke out from its rear. Take out the ringleader, a bearded dude, then the one to his left and right. Zeb centered on Beard, his escape route mapped out in his mind if a quick getaway was needed. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, and his breathing slowed. The people on the street jostled and surged forward, and yells of fury reached him. Not yet, he cautioned himself. They aren't attacking. Anger is no reason to open fire. The explosion, when it came, caught him unawares. Chapter 4. His head swiveled on hearing the dull whump. He stared in horror as a RPG slammed into the Ranger's Jeep and flung it against the wall of a hotel. A Somalian fighter, his face covered by a red towel, had emerged from the cover of the car wreck and was calmly reloading his rocket launcher. He was joined by 6 fighters, who opened fire on the Ranger vehicle. Zeb rose, glanced once at the crowd which had dispersed, and moved swiftly towards the jeep. He scanned the street, identified the positions of the various Somalian fighters, assessed threat levels, all done unconsciously, on auto mode. He didn't rush, he didn't hurry. Speed was essential, but so was calm action. Zeb was more than 1,000 yards away, looking down, when Launcher Guy yelled something to his fellow fighters and they fell back. Launcher Guy started raising his weapon. Zeb bent to one knee, his sniping rifle coming to his shoulder. Launcher Guy's weapon came to his shoulder. Zeb zeroed in on him, waiting for his breathing to reach bottom of respiratory cycle. Launcher Guy made adjustments, readying to propel death. Zeb curled his finger on the trigger, pulled gently, and Launcher Guy's head disappeared in a red mist. The Somalian fighters stared in disbelief at his falling body, and then at one another. By the time they grasped there was another threat vector, it was too late. Zeb took them out, in tightly spaced shots, not giving them the opportunity to react. He waited after the last man had fallen, and when he was sure there were no more rebels left, he went to the back of the roof, swung off a rickety pipe and landed lightly. A look to his left, his rifle following his eyes. No hostiles. The right was clear. He approached the burning jeep swiftly, spotting a ranger's leg trapped under it. Alive, he's alive. He ignored the heat of the vehicle as he strained to lift a corner of the jeep's carcass and free the trapped ranger. A pair of hands appeared above, and then another, as 2 rangers rushed from their hideouts to help. "Thanks, dude. We'd be at the pearly gates by now if you hadn't showed up," a ranger sergeant, one of the helpers, said gratefully. "Which unit are you with?" Zeb didn't reply. He crouched over the now freed man and assessed him. "Leg seems to be broken. Hopefully it will set right. He's in shock, needs immediate care." He radioed in for help and kept watch over the men till reinforcements arrived and took away the rangers. The man with the trapped leg was Broker, an analyst with military intelligence who had been deployed with the Rangers unit to improve the quality of intel on the ground. Broker had acquired a legendary status in Pentagon circles for his ability to sift through random events, connect seemingly disparate ones, and make predictions that invariably proved right. He could read through data as if it told a story to him. Generals fought with one another to get him to work on their missions. When the military was looking for a good analyst to send along with TFR, his was the only name on the list. Broker's leg was operated on immediately back at the TFR base, and he hobbled out of his rudimentary ward 3 days later. The docs told him he was lucky. If the jeep had remained on his leg for longer, the damage would have been greater. It might have had to be amputated. As it was, Broker would walk with a permanent limp. Broker was okay with that. A limp beat a prosthetic any day. He made a beeline to the ranger sergeant and asked him who their savior was. Dude didn't speak, let alone tell his name, the sergeant snorted. He's one of those Delta guys. You know how they are. Broker went to the Delta guys and asked around. No one gave him the time of the day. He went to the attack site and swung himself to the rooftop with some difficulty. He looked around searching for something, anything, and then he saw the tracks. The roof had a fine layer of dust and didn't see much traffic. The single set of prints was clear. They started from one end of the roof, where the dust seemed to be compacted. As if he was lying prone, Broker thought, and then went in the jeep's direction. The steps were evenly spaced initially, and then grew longer, as if the dude had been running. They stopped abruptly, and Broker stopped too. He knelt and looked at the smudge on the roof. Maybe a knee to press. He looked where the jeep would have been. Close to a 1,000-yard shot. Under pressure, since that Somalian was readying to let fly. Down on one knee, not the best shooting position, and yet his round counted. The rest of his shooting had been evenly spaced, as if he was at target practice. Broker wasn't the Pentagon's ace intelligence analyst for nothing. He persevered, asked around, and when he went back stateside, he hacked into top-secret files. Sure, they could court-martial him, but only if they caught him. That happening is as likely as my turning into a saint, Broker sniffed and started reading the files. He could finally put a name to that face. Zeb Carter, the files told him. Carter refused to meet him and rebuffed all advances. He likes his privacy, another operative told Broker one evening, over a beer in D.C. You won't find him at bars with the rest of the guys, chilling out like most of us. He hardly drinks, doesn't talk much, and doesn't encourage friendships. He's married. Got kids? Broker asked, intrigued. The operative took a deep pull, wiped his lips, and looked around to see if anyone was listening. No one was. The bar in DuPont Circle was virtually empty that time of the day. At the far end, the bartender lazily polished glasses, while the only other customer was snoring in a corner. Now that's a story, the operative leaned closer and whispered. No one knows for sure, but there are rumors that his wife and son were killed. He was captured, along with his family, in Iraq by terrorists. They raped his wife in front of him and his son. They tortured both and killed them slowly. Then they let him go. He dropped out of the army and disappeared for a couple of years. No one knows where he went. One day, he returned just like that. As if he hadn't been away. He aced the physicals and the psychological tests. He was back in business. Broker carefully placed his mug on the counter. For some reason his fingers were trembling. Did he get those terrorists? He asked hoarsely. The operative shook his head. Way I heard it, nope. For all we know, those animals might still be out there. Broker stayed in the bar long after the operative had left. The bar filled, music came on, people jostled him and shouted in his ears. Broker was lost in his own world, wondering how a man could come back from that and still operate at superhuman levels. Only Zeb Carter could, he decided, and went out in the night and stood staring for long moments at the tall white obelisk that was visible in the distance, rising above the rest of the city in silent majesty. Broker was not a religious man, and neither was he given to impulsive gestures. However, that night something compelled him to snap a smart salute, whisper a silent prayer in the sky, and hope he and Carter would meet again. They would. 5 years later. Do you know why the agency was formed? The woman in the office didn't respond, knowing it was a rhetorical question. The speaker, a tall man broad-shouldered with an easy smile and deep warmth, wasn't looking at her. He was leaning against his desk, his legs crossed, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to his forearms. The desk was a deep brown in color and gleamed and shone on the light-colored carpet it sat on. The desk wasn't any ordinary desk, the man wasn't any ordinary one. The President of the United States walked about in the Oval Office as he answered his own question. We have enough intelligence and counterterrorism agencies in this country. Each one of them does a specialist job and are good at it. We have no lack of covert agencies either. Almost all these agencies suffer from a couple of drawbacks. He raised a finger. One, none of them is really covert. The media and the wider public know about their existence to some extent. Another manicured finger extended. Many of them are also quite big and require extensive administration. That hampers the very purpose they were set up for. He turned to the silent woman. The agency was set up to be different. However, in its current form, I don't see how dissimilar it is to other such units. You have a free hand. Take the agency apart, build it back again, and make it a compact unit that is nimble and is invisible. The woman rose. She was almost as tall as him, slim, dark-haired, and gray-eyed. She had an ice-cool demeanor, and he had deep faith in her capabilities. He wouldn't have appointed her the director of the agency if he wasn't confident in her abilities. Claire, the director, left the White House in deep thought, subliminally aware of the curious glances she drew as she moved down the hallway. Her title was nebulous. She was the director of strategy. No one exactly knew what strategy she advised the president on. The few who knew of her existence were aware that she reported only to the man and that she wielded enormous clout. Claire had started in the agency as an intelligence analyst and had risen fast in an organization that welcomed unconventional thinking and decisive action. The incumbent director saw a star in her and nominated her as his successor when he had to retire due to health issues. The president met her once for an initial half-hour meeting that extended to 90 minutes and green-lighted her appointment. He's right, she thought, as she buckled into her vehicle, and her bodyguard drove her 2 blocks away from the most famous address on the planet. The agency was set up to go after non-conventional threats to national security. However, it has become just another covert agency. The president doesn't need another deep black unit. He has enough of those. He needs one that doesn't exist. In the next few months, she downsized the agency, eliminating almost all of its admin functions, and reassigned its operatives to other military intelligence agencies. She was in no particular hurry, since at the time, getting the organization right was more important than taking on missions. She drew up various structures, debated them with her close confidant, General Daniel Klaus, National Security Advisor, and rejected almost all of them. One organization format remained, but it still didn't excite her. One evening, as summer piled its heat on a somnolent DC, she went out to dinner with a close friend, Cassandra. Cass and she had met while studying at Bryn Mawr. They clicked and their friendship deepened when they both went on to Penn. Upon graduation, Claire forged a career in the agency, while Cass had joined the State Department and had ended up being an aide to the Secretary of State. She had tired of politics and had quit to pursue an academic career in New York. The two still stayed in touch and met whenever one of them was in the other's town. They talked about their times in college and discussed Cass's work at her university. They didn't talk about Claire's job. Cass knew her friend worked at some super-secret outfit and was in the president's circle. Claire didn't tell her of the agency, nor of its missions. She didn't have to. A friendship such as theirs could weather work-related constraints. They were sipping their coffees when Claire spotted the man leaning against a lamppost on the sidewalk in front of their restaurant. He was facing a window, and there was no one else obstructing her view. People rushed on the street, there were metros to catch and homes to get to, yet the man stood still, motionless, unaware of the traffic that flowed around him. Not unaware, she realized, as she looked closer. The man was alert and yet relaxed at the same time. She had seen that trait in some of the best operatives she had worked with. For a moment she thought he was a threat, but a discreet phone call with her protection team reassured her. They too were watching him, and would take him down if he showed any signs of moving on her. Cass broke off from the story she was narrating and followed Claire's eyes. "He's a looker, isn't he?" "I wouldn't say that," Claire replied dryly. The man had good features, light brown hair that was cut short, and was lean and taut. He wore a white shirt tucked into brown jeans, and on his hips was a snug belt. He wasn't model handsome. Neither was he average. "Wait," her voice sharpened. "You know him?" "Oh yeah." "Not in the way you're thinking," her friend ribbed her. "That's Zeb, my brother." Claire turned to her in shock. They had practically grown up together, shared dorm rooms and apartments, and not once had she known Cass had a brother. She knew that her friend had grown up with foster parents and had a troubled childhood. "You never told me about a brother." "We went to different foster families. He had a worse time than I as a child. Once he joined the army, he decided it was safer to show no siblings, no family." "Safer." "Safer for me. He was in some covert unit in the army. He must have worked on some real intense missions if he was that worried about blowback to you." "He did. He never told me about them, but I know he's got the scars." She laughed lightly, but there was an underlying seriousness in her words. "That man out there is one of the most lethal people you will ever meet." Chapter 5. It took a while for Claire to lay her hands on Zeb Carter's files. It wasn't that she didn't have the security clearances for them, or that anyone refused her. Some of his files were redacted, and to get to the original version meant she had to get through several layers of military bureaucracy. General Klaus intervened and she finally got the digitized as well as the paper files. She took them on a Friday night, hoping to finish reading by bedtime. It was 2 a.m., and she had a couple of glasses of wine inside her when she turned the last page. She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling fan, watching it turn, wondering what made a man like Carter tick. What made him recover from the killing of his family? Many operatives would have gone to pieces after such a horrific experience. He had not only come back, but he came back stronger. Where had he been those 2 years? Had he hunted down the terrorists? She flipped the pages again. Nope. He hadn't. Or at least there was no record of his doing so. He had a strong moral code and believed in doing what was right. That had resulted in his going against his superior's wishes several times. He hadn't been disciplined, however, and his file was blemish-free. His awards and medals? Her breath had caught when she had gone through them and all the commendations he had received. I want him in the agency, was her last waking thought. He's running his own business in New York. Why would he get back into the game? She debated with herself the next day. No harm in asking. But first, I want to get a feel for him. Cass made it easy for her to check out Carter. He goes running in Central Park every day. That's the best place to meet him. Claire thanked her in reply, shaking her head. Cass. She knows me too well. She was in New York for the next 2 days, in Central Park at 5 a.m. each morning, wearing a tracksuit and a hoodie to cover her face. She spotted Carter the first day, on the route that Cass had texted her. She made no attempt to approach him that day. On the second, she ran well behind him, and after her 5 miles broke off and was cooling down when she spotted Carter on a nearby flat green. A gaggle of people were watching him, even that early in the morning. Carter's routine seemed to be a combination of various martial arts moves, improvised heavily. It was his speed that struck her. He too was cooling down, judging by the soaked tee he wore, yet his intensity and ferocity had her agape. There was fluidity to his motion, and a school kid clapped at one point. She observed him the next day from her car, and followed him during the rest of the day. Breakfast at a diner. Meeting with a suit, who seemed to be a client. Lunch at a food truck. A stroll in the city in the evening. No dates. No female companions. Or male for that matter. His routine was unchanged the 3rd and the 4th day. In the evening of the 4th day, she came back to her car to find a note folded under her windshield wiper. If you are wishing to kill me, you are taking too long. If you're a friend, there are better ways to meet. She visited his office the next day, in a building on the 14th story of a tall, mirrored glass building on Columbus Avenue. She hung around the building for some time, going through what she would say, perfecting her pitch. She worked with the most powerful man in the world, she had met several world leaders, she interacted with 4-star generals, and with none of those had she spent as much time in preparation. The security staff in the lobby tried to stop her from going up the elevators, something about not having a prior appointment. She shut their protests with a White House badge and warned them not to call Carter. The walnut-paneled elevator was soundless as it sped up and opened its doors with a near-soundless whoosh. She crossed a narrow hallway and entered Carter's office, stopping for a moment to read the ZC Consulting sign on the open door. Saved me going to a branding consultant who would have charged me a bundle and come up with the same name, Carter's voice came from her right. So he's got a sense of humor. Cass said he rarely smiled. She swiveled her head and took her first close look at the man who was rising from his chair and walking towards her. Languid, calm were her first impressions. Carter's face was unmarked but for fine lines around his eyes. He was wearing a gray tee this time, tucked into blue jeans, the same leather belt around him. Zeb Carter, ma'am, he shook her hand firmly and let it go. His dark eyes didn't stray from her face. I reckon you know my name. Claire, she offered and took the seat he indicated. Just Claire. Yeah. Those who know me don't need. Got it. So why have you been following me around? I head a deep black agency. I want you to join it, she told him baldly, discarding her carefully constructed opening pitch. He didn't react for a second and kept staring at her. He rose from behind his desk when she didn't look away and closed the door to his office. You could make that up, but it wouldn't be hard to verify. Not for me. I presume you know something about me. Correct. Cassandra. No other way you would have known about me. Correct again, she agreed. She and I go a long way back. He rose again, and in that panther-like walk of his, disappeared round a corner and came back with 2 mugs of coffee, a pot of milk and sugar cubes. He poured for her when she indicated no milk or sugar and went behind the desk. Tell me, he told her when they took the first sips. He didn't cross his arms and didn't display any defensive gesture. She felt the first stirring of hope but cautioned herself he might still turn me down. She told him everything. Who she was. How she had joined the agency. Why it was formed. Who its current operatives were. She saw his eyes narrow when she mentioned a few names and she stopped, expecting some questions. She resumed when he didn't utter a word and continued for another couple of hours. Neither of them spoke for a while when she had finished. Motes of dust danced in the fading rays of sunlight that came through a window. A cruiser wailed as it raced through the street outside, its sound muted by layers of concrete and thick glass. There was no other sound in the office. No clock ticked. No refrigerator hummed. The office was bare of any personal effects, no happy, smiling photographs. No commendations or certificates. Just the desk. A few chairs. Whitewashed walls. A computer. A printer in the corner. A water fountain. His phone. A file. And him watching her. Something going through his mind that she wished she was privy to. How would it work? You would come to work for me. We would recruit the rest of the crew. How's that different from any other covert agency? That stumped her. She had toyed with just that problem for months and had no answer. What would you suggest? That you leave, ma'am. This conversation never happened. You get back to DC. I get back to my business. This is what satisfies you, she gestured at the empty office. You quit Special Forces for this? To advise overpaid execs on protecting themselves and their business? It pays my bills, ma'am. Handsomely. I work with whom I choose. I drop clients I don't like. There is no one to give me orders. No one to tell me who to kill. His lips quirked sardonically, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You've read my file. You know I've a problem with blind obedience. I won't go back to that life again. I don't want blind obedience. I want to be challenged. You will choose the missions. He didn't reply, his closed expression didn't change. She didn't give up and cast her mind back to his files seeking some hook to interest him. She knew all about his consulting work and his clients. She had gotten powerful computers to go through his movements for the last few years. Something came to her mind randomly. A visit of his to New Mexico to advise an oil company, a year ago. The death of a woman trafficker in the city he was visiting, during his stay. The release of several captive girls. The law enforcement authorities had no clue who killed the gangster or released the girls. Her near-eidetic memory brought back unexplained killings of gangsters in cities he had visited. Batman syndrome was a phrase used often in his file. You killed him, didn't you? She hazarded a wild guess. That trafficker in Albuquerque. You rescued those teen girls. The FBI is still looking for that gangster's killer. I consult for companies, ma'am. Nothing more. Another snippet of news flashed in her mind. The kidnapping of a retail magnate's sole child, his teenage daughter, while vacationing in their house in Mexico. A drug cartel had demanded an enormous ransom. The federales and the FBI, individually and jointly, had raided several of the gang's known hideouts, but the girl hadn't been found. The billionaire had caved in to the ransom demands when his daughter's finger had been couriered to him. Negotiations were currently underway for the exchange. Hollenbrook, she breathed softly when she recalled the latest news article. I know they are your clients. The father hired you to rescue his daughter, Lauren, didn't he? I'm not at liberty to say who my clients are, ma'am. I can confirm this. I'm not involved in any negotiations with any criminal gang. Carter escorted her to the door and held it open for her. I wish you luck with your agency, ma'am. I am sure you'll find your operatives. Lauren Hollenbrook was held in a remote ranch in the Sonoran state of Mexico. The ranch was at an elevation of 4,000 feet and had barbed wire running all around its 3,000 acres. Only a determined observer could tell that the fence was electrified and that the ranch house had exotic security not seen in any other ranch in the neighborhood. 15 men were in the main ranch house when the first grenade arced through the night and reduced the guest house to rubble. A second grenade took out the generator room and brought darkness to the inside of the house. The 15 men were well-trained, deserters from the Mexican Special Forces. They tried their radios to contact the cartel's boss, who was in Hermosillo. They found their radios were jammed. They tried their phones. Those too didn't have a signal. They did not know how large the attacking force was since they hadn't seen anyone. 2 men guarded the girls' room, which had one bathroom window overlooking the rear of the ranch. 8 men crawled outside the house, careful not to show their bodies to any watcher, and mounted an outside perimeter. The remaining 5 remained inside, watchful and alert. They had automatic weapons, 2 RPGs, enough ammo, food and water to withstand a siege from any large force. They weren't prepared for a loner attack, especially from an operative of Zeb's caliber. Zeb had spent 3 months in the country following Claire's visit, disguised as a farm worker, working on remote ranches as he moved across the vast country. The feds knew that Lauren was not in any major city in the country, the only concrete intel they had. They had tracked the ransom demands to the west of Mexico, but hadn't been able to narrow it down any further. Zeb had got his first clue in Guadalajara, when working with a rancher who was looking to have a sophisticated security setup for his dude ranch. The rancher's preferred contractor in Durango had disappeared. He's the only one who can install what I want, the rancher had spat and scratched his head. Way I heard he's got some secret commission. Maybe cartel work, he had said darkly. It might be nothing, Zeb thought, but had investigated, and that slim, almost non-existent lead had taken him north following the coast when he had come to Hermosillo. There he got talking to a trucker who had said he had driven a lot to Bavaspe to stock up a store. What's unusual about that? Zeb asked him as he helped the trucker load his vehicle. Taking a lot of medicines up there. Never done that before. All of us need medicines, Zeb told him. The good Lord can do only so much. Not these kind, the trucker replied. These are for some kind of allergy I haven't heard of. Zeb's ears pricked up. Lauren Hollenbrook suffered from a rare allergy that could be dangerous if untreated for long. Bavaspe had less than 1,500 people, and in such a small municipality, anyone inquiring about medicines would stand out. Zeb didn't ask questions. He rented a tired-looking Toyota, advertised himself as a farm laborer, and worked on several farms and ranchers, spreading out wider and wider, going to remote parts of the state. And then he came across the cartel's ranch, and once he got there, days of surveillance confirmed that the men in the ranch belonged to the gang. Further observation showed that the specific drug from Bavaspe's store ended up at the ranch. Zeb made no attempt to get close to the ranch. The initial grenades from his launcher had decimated the outer buildings around the main house. More explosives had destroyed the single-track road to the ranch. He wasn't worried about an aerial attack. The cartel wouldn't take to the air, and even if they did, they wouldn't be looking for a single person. No one would believe Hollenbrook would employ just one man to bring back his daughter. In any case, he was camo-ed up and had gear on him to evade thermal and radar surveillance. If they got to him, maybe he would die. He didn't fear death. He used to once when he had a he pushed the thought out of his mind and focused on rescuing Lauren Hollenbrook. Zeb took out 2 men in the night from long distance, and imagined the panic growing amongst the surviving men. He had rigged several rifles around the ranch and timed each of them to fire intermittently, giving the impression that the attackers were many. Similarly, he had flashlights go on and off throughout the night. Voice recorders taped to low shrubs whispered commands and instructions. At 4 a.m., when the body's metabolism was at its lowest ebb, he started his long, slow crawl. At 6 a.m., as the sun painted the sky in gold and orange, he killed 3 more on the perimeter. He got the layout from one man who spewed out answers quickly. The gangster had a knife jammed deep in his thigh and a grenade thrust in his mouth. He had no reason to lie. Another man confirmed the layout, the positions, and the armaments of the remaining hostiles. Zeb donned the clothing of one of the dead men and entered the ranch house at 7 a.m. He didn't indulge in lengthy firefights or stealthy stalking. He lobbed fire and smoke grenades and let them do their work, staying in a corner, covered by sacks of grain from the kitchen store. He tossed flashbangs for good effect, and by 8 a.m., only the 2 guards outside Lauren's room remained. He knew they would be jittery, trigger-happy. He didn't approach them. He tossed something through the corridor that led to the room and heard the sound of one man retching when he recognized what the object was. It was the head of one of the hostiles. "You don't have to end like that," he told them in Spanish. "Release the girl and surrender and you will live." The men didn't move. They fired a volley in Zeb's direction. All the rounds went wide. Zeb turned on a voice recorder and a man shrieked loudly and started sobbing. A louder scream sounded and the voice prayed and begged. A shot sounded, followed by a thump, and a body fell in the corridor from around a corner. "He was your friend, wasn't he?" Zeb asked them. The 2 men didn't reply. He selected another recording, and this time the agonized shout was longer and louder. "Stop," one man yelled. "I'm coming out." "No," the other man yelled at him, and the 2 argued furiously. "Take your time. I'm in no hurry," Zeb told them. "I'm going to kill another buddy of yours." They fell silent on hearing him, whispered among themselves, and the second man asked, "You promise we will live?" "Yeah." "How can we believe you?" the other questioned. Zeb sighed. "You can't. But I can guarantee I'll kill you if you don't surrender." More whispers. More argument. The 2 men seemed to be getting nowhere when Lauren Hollenbrook made their decision for them. "Help. Can anyone hear me?" she screamed from her room, her voice audible in the quiet ranch house. "I'll count to 3, Zeb told the 2 men once Lauren had fallen silent. 1, he lay down and brought his rifle to his shoulder. 2, he centered on the corner to the corridor. An Uzi flew through the air and crashed into a wall. Another automatic rifle followed. 2 handguns came next, and the first hood appeared around the corner. The second gangster stood behind him, and the 2 men eyed the enormous lounge nervously. It was empty but for those sacks in the corner. Where were the soldiers? The federales? Zeb shot the first man and finished the second man with a 1-2. He threw another flashbang and emerged cautiously from his hide. The corridor was clear, no other hostiles remained. He stepped over the 2 bodies, feeling no remorse over killing them. "I promised them they'd live. Didn't tell them for how long." He rapped once on the captor's door. "Lauren Hollenbrook." "Yes. God, yes. Who are you?" "Ma'am, I'm here to take you to your dad." "Thank you." "Oh my God, thank you," she shrieked and then started sobbing. Zeb masked his face with a bandana and opened the door and got his first look at the kidnapped woman. She lay huddled in a corner, her face tear-streaked and blackened. One hand was damaged, and when she raised it to wipe her face, Zeb's face tightened. She stared with wide eyes at him and rose shakily to her feet. "Are you American?" she asked him. "Yes, ma'am." He helped her to her feet and blocked her view with his body. "Ma'am, you'll have to trust me for a few more hours." I'm going to blindfold you and lead you out. In a few hours you'll be back home. Home. Lauren's lips trembled at the word, and her eyes started tearing up. She nodded jerkily and sniffled when he tied the black strip across her eyes. He led her out of the house, steering her clear of the bodies. What's your name? Why are you hiding your face? She asked an hour later, after they had trekked through open country and had reached his Toyota. She had asked several questions on the way and had received no answer. I don't have one, ma'am, he replied, as he drove them to a private airstrip where a Cessna would be waiting for them. His vehicle looked battered, but underneath its hood was a souped-up engine. He concentrated on driving as fast as he could on narrow roads, keeping an eye out for any pursuers. Are you FBI? No, ma'am. My dad sent you. Yes, ma'am. You can talk to him. He pulled out a cell phone, dialed a number, and gave her the handset. Dad? She asked, the hope in her voice dissolving to deep sobbing at the sound of her father's voice. She spoke to him at length and thrust the handset in Zeb's direction when she had finished. He wants to talk to you. Mr. Carter? The billionaire's voice was choked when Zeb greeted him. Anything I have is yours, Mr. Carter. You just have to ask. Everything. Even my life. Chapter 6. Claire watched the news unfold in fascination as TV trucks outside Hollenbrook's Los Angeles mansion relayed live feeds of Lauren arriving in a black SUV. Her father held her and talked briefly with a TV reporter and promised a press conference later in the day. No one knew how she had been rescued. The Mexican government said it had played no role, but were glad that she was free. The FBI said it didn't have anything to do with the development. Through her network, Claire knew a ranch house had been discovered in Sonora with several dead men in it. That cartel's lost its best shooters in one night, the head of the Mexican Special Forces told her. Maybe Hollenbrook hired the best mercenaries. TV anchormen and women brought talking heads together and filled airtime with pointless speculation, waiting for the press conference. Claire made several calls and spoke to various people in the country. No mercenaries seemed to have been recruited for the rescue. She had a hunch while waiting for Hollenbrook to appear on screen. She spoke to some of Carter's clients, one of whom confirmed he hadn't seen the former soldier for months. She finally called Hollenbrook himself, and when he came online, introduced herself and congratulated him. Thank you, ma'am, he responded, mystified. I already got a call from the president's chief of staff. I wasn't expecting another call from the White House. She spun him a story about the war on drugs, cartel activity, and how she was helping formulate a new strategy to deal with gangs. She knew he didn't buy it, but she didn't care. Who rescued your daughter, sir? I'm not at liberty to say. They're the kind of people who value their privacy. I'm sure you understand that, he replied warily. All I can say is, I owe those involved a debt of gratitude which I can never repay. The press conference was similarly anticlimactic. Hollenbrook refused to reveal the rescuers' identities despite repeated questioning. He thanked the rescuers, thanked the media for their interest, and was hustled away by his people. General Klaus called her in the evening with the first positive news. It's got the signs of your man. He has done it before. I was speaking to some generals in the Pentagon, and one of them briefed me on a rescue mission in Panama. Our ambassador's daughter had been abducted by gunmen who were threatening to execute her. Carter went in with 2 other Delta operatives, and in the final stages of the assault, was alone. In Mogadishu he took down Jamma, a warlord. He has the track record. Claire knew about Jamma from Carter's files, but Panama was news to her. She questioned Klaus at length and hung up, after promising to meet him the next day to discuss agency matters. She was early to the meeting and waited in the exclusive members-only club in Georgetown, going through various intelligence reports till the general arrived. The club was run by a former White House staffer who had installed the best security and vetting procedures. His clientele needed a safe environment to meet, away from the prying eyes of the media. Its members included several former presidents, congressmen, and senators, and several Pentagon generals. Not many knew Claire even in that rarefied environment, which suited her just fine. She paid no attention to the server who placed a tray with fine bone china in it and served her a cup of tea. "You got your agents, ma'am?" Claire looked up dumbfounded to see Carter, the server, rearrange the tray and occupy the seat opposite her. She looked around half expecting to see her protection detail rush in, or maybe a trail of bodies. "No one's dead, ma'am." "Not even injured," he read her thoughts and smiled slightly. He was utterly relaxed, dressed in a formal shirt and trousers, his black shoes gleaming, and didn't seem to be awed by a former president seated a few feet away. She took a deep breath and composed herself. "Not yet. The one I want declined my offer." "Maybe you should ask again." She stared at him, not believing her ears. "What changed your mind?" He broke away from her eyes and glanced at the muted TV on a wall that was replaying Hollenbrook's press conference. "Maybe I want to do what's right," he said tersely, and didn't elaborate. "There are conditions," he warned her when she leaned forward in excitement. "Name them." "I want total freedom in recruiting the operatives. I will select them myself. I don't want any interference from anyone. Done, though I will want to see them before they come on board. I will source our gear. Everything that we need will be picked by me or by my crew." "No problem. We won't work for you. We'll have no connection to you." She blinked, trying to figure out what he meant. "Explain." "We'll work for the consulting business. We'll rebrand that if we have to, but that'll be a real business based out of New York, with genuine clients. We'll work with our clients when we are in between." He raised an eyebrow to see if Claire had understood. She had. In between was when there were no active missions. "We'll need access to facilities to train, but I or my crew will arrange that. I have contacts. They'll have their network, we'll tap into those. All we'll want from you is the intel, the missions, and the juice." Juice, his word for the clout she wielded. She liked it. Juice. She leaned back, steepling her fingers as her mind raced. Zero admin. Total deniability. Sure, the details need to fleshed out, but it'll work. "Welcome aboard," she told him, and with that the agency was reborn. They didn't shake hands, nor did they drink in celebration. They dived into the details, discussing various elements, and drew up a to-do list. He rose when they had finished, but she waved him down. "You'll work on that?" "Yes, ma'am. But there's something more important than this list." "What's that?" "I need to find an intel guy." "I can get you a list." He shook his head. "You're forgetting our arrangement. I know who I want. I'll have to convince him, however. I wasn't very cooperative when he reached out to me a while back." Zeb wanted broker. He had followed the intelligence analyst's career over the years and knew he had left the army and had gone into private practice. He briefed oil companies on geopolitical events and their likely impact. Politicians came to him for his expertise on various geographies. Police forces hired him as a consultant, and he was a frequent visitor to the FBI's Hoover Building in D.C. Large corporations hired him to report back on competitor activity. Broker's office was in downtown Manhattan, and on his return from D.C., Zeb started with the simplest of approaches, a phone call. The call went to Broker's voicemail, and after leaving a message, Zeb waited. He waited for 2 days, and then decided to meet him in person. Meeting Broker was easier said than done. He was seldom alone, and usually had a female companion on his arm. He deployed counter-surveillance tactics when he was by himself, and doubled up frequently or randomly changed directions when on foot or driving. Zeb posted a card to him with a need-to-meet line and scribbled his number. His phone didn't ring. After a week of following the analyst, Zeb had enough. He went into a bar where Broker was holding court and observed him for a while from afar. Broker cut a dashing figure with his immaculate attire and tall frame. His blonde hair was artfully styled, and was just that 1 inch longer, giving him a corporate me look. His naturally gregarious nature drew people to him, and 4 men and 2 women hung on to every word of his in the bar. Broker threw his head back once and roared in laughter. The smile didn't die, nor did his eyes flicker when they rested on Zeb. An hour passed, still Broker made no move to end his party and join the waiting man. Zeb gave it another hour and then gate crashed. "Sorry folks, I need to talk to Broker." "Whoa," a red-faced man in the group rounded on Zeb. "Back off, buddy, this is a private party." "It's over." Redface saw something in Zeb's eyes and mumbled a few choice curses and walked away, dragging along another friend. Broker watched for a moment and then held his hands up in surrender. He shrugged apologetically and smiled at those still at the bar. "Sorry folks, duty calls." "You got my messages?" Zeb asked him when they were alone. "Yeah." "Can we talk?" "We are talking." "I get it, you are upset that I didn't meet you after Mogadishu. That was a long time back. That's some chip you're still carrying on your shoulder." A muscle on Broker's face twitched and his jaws clenched and relaxed. He looked straight ahead and downed his beer in a gulp, without speaking. Zeb let him be, and ordered a drink for himself while his companion dealt with whatever was going through his mind. "You're right." Broker's voice was contrite when he broke the silence. "I tried to thank you. My ego couldn't take it that you rebuffed me. As you say, it's history." He held out his hand and Zeb gripped it. "Can we talk someplace private?" Zeb asked him. Broker looked at the bartender. "Jose, that private room you have, it's available?" Jose looked on a screen, punched a few keys, and waved them towards the end of the room. "It is now." Broker sank into an armchair in the small room that had a couple more chairs and a small table. It was meant for private meetings or for card games among friends. He flashed a smile at Zeb and crossed his legs. "So what's so important that you had to break up my party?" "I need you." Broker stretched and yawned when he walked out of the bar and stood on the sidewalk. Zeb had left a few minutes earlier, after the two had spent several hours in deep discussion. Zeb, it was Zeb now, not Carter anymore, had explained about the agency and its purpose. He didn't bring up confidentiality or need to know or any of the oaths that Broker had taken while serving his country. Broker looked in the direction Zeb had gone, but the night had swallowed him. "He trusted me." Broker had listened in silence at Zeb's plans about Claire, and his initial skepticism had given way to interest. "He knew I was bored. The money's good in the private sector, but I don't do this for money." Broker had kept tabs on Zeb too. He has suspicions about the former Delta operative's side jobs. Heck, he was reasonably sure that it was Zeb who had rescued Lauren Hollenbrook, and at one point during the evening, had asked him outright. "Yeah," Zeb had answered simply. No denial. No embellishment. No details. It was enough for Broker. It showed that Zeb trusted him fully, and from then on he was in. "Zeb Carter wants me," he told the listening night, and a deep warmth spread through him. "If Zeb Carter needs me, I will be there. I will join him in the agency. I won't even need to fold my business. It will merge with his. Those consulting services will be our cover." Zeb called Claire the next day as she was heading to the White House. "We've got Broker. I know the other operatives I want. I am sure they'll sign on too. They'll drop whatever they are doing and join you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" "Because I asked, ma'am." There was no boastfulness in his voice. No ego. It was a simple statement of fact, and brought to her mind something General Klaus had said when she had mentioned Carter's name. There's a kind of soldier who will place duty above all else. Carter's one of those. I guess Broker and the other operatives Carter has in mind are cut from that same cloth. His voice cut short her musing, and for the first time since meeting him, she heard a smile in his voice. "We are in business, ma'am." Claire hung up and looked out unseeingly as her car drove past the National Mall, the imposing Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument, and slowed to enter the White House's gates. Having broker was important as having Zeb. A good analyst improved a mission's probability of success multifold. Broker wasn't just a good analyst, he was the best. General Klaus had confirmed that. He had been excited on hearing Broker's name and had exclaimed, "Claire, if you have Carter and Broker in your team, you're already on a winning streak." She discussed various matters with the president, and as she rose to leave, she told him, "We're in business, sir." He understood in a flash. He smiled widely, the same smile that had won him millions of hearts and minds and votes up and down the country, and had charmed billions across the world. The smile lingered for a while and disappeared, leaving his face somber. "Fantastic. Don't let me down." "We won't, sir." And she hadn't. Zeb Carter hadn't. Not even once. The end.